Hey, traveler. Tonight I thought we'd talk about medieval concubinage. Where are you in the world right now, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. Ever wonder about the blurry lines of relationships in the past? We might think of marriage as the ultimate commitment, a legally and religiously sanctioned union. But medieval people, well, their love lives were a bit more complicated. The difference was, society often looked the other way when powerful men sought companionship outside of marriage, though not always with kindness. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was a life of solitude or a politically motivated match, a little flexibility suddenly looked brilliant. Imagine if dating apps existed back then. Tinder for kings, perhaps. The profile? Seeking heir, enjoys falconry, not afraid of a little church disapproval. Now that we've set the stage, let's talk about defining concubinage. It wasn't marriage. It wasn't quite prostitution either, though there could be overlaps. Picture this situation. A lord needs an heir, but his wife struggles to conceive. Or perhaps a knight, far from home, desires companionship, but doesn't want to break his vows. Concubinage offered a solution, a shadow marriage, a whispered agreement. It was a relationship with varying degrees of commitment and recognition, depending on the people involved and the society they lived in. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of "it's complicated on Facebook," only with potentially higher stakes. Speaking of blurry lines, let's delve into the legal and religious perspectives. The Church, of course, generally frowned upon concubinage. Officially, sex was for procreation within the bonds of holy matrimony. But medieval people, well, they were experts at navigating the gray areas. What was the difference? Canon law condemned it, but civil law often tolerated it, especially among the nobility. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but the prospect of social upheaval often encouraged a blind eye. It's like the medieval version of tax loopholes, technically legal, morally questionable, and benefiting the powerful. But what good is legal tolerance without social context? Here's the thing. Concubinage was often a pragmatic solution to the rigid structures of medieval society. Marriages were about alliances, property, and securing the bloodline. Love? Well, that was a bonus, not a requirement. But medieval people, well, they needed affection too. The difference was, concubinage offered a space for companionship outside the political chessboard of marriage. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was a life of loveless union arranged for strategic gain, a little tenderness on the side suddenly looked brilliant. When your alternative was an arranged marriage to someone who makes your skin crawl, a bit of whispered affection in the shadows sounds mighty appealing. From social context to the shadows of the convent, let's consider the women involved. A woman might enter concubinage for various reasons: lack of dowry, lower social status, or even genuine affection for her partner. But medieval people, well, their options were limited. The difference was, women often lacked the agency to choose their own path. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but the possibility of security and companionship, even within a precarious arrangement, could be tempting. A woman caught up in the medieval web of concubinage would probably read a modern romance novel and think, these problems are nothing. Now that we've covered the motivations, let's talk about the prevalence of concubinage. It was rampant among the clergy, nobility, and even commoners, though its visibility varied across social classes. But medieval people? Well, they knew how to keep secrets. The difference was, power often shielded the practice from scrutiny. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but the ability to turn a blind eye was a privilege of the elite. It's like a medieval version of what happens in the castle stays in the castle, but with potentially illegitimate heirs. Speaking of visibility, let's examine the blurry boundaries. How did concubinage differ from marriage? Marriage involved a public ceremony, dowry agreements, and legal recognition. Concubinage was often a private affair, lacking formal contracts and societal validation. But medieval people, well, they knew how to bend the rules. The difference was the line blurred when children were involved. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but the desire to legitimize offspring often led to complex negotiations and shifting social attitudes. You might be thinking, this sounds like a medieval soap opera. You're not wrong. But what good is a definition without considering the consequences? Concubines often faced social stigma, limited legal rights, and the constant threat of displacement if their partner married or died. But medieval people, well, they were resilient. The difference was, women often found ways to navigate the system, using their influence to secure their children's future or carve out a degree of independence. It's like being a contestant on Medieval Survivor, but with higher stakes and fewer immunity idols. From consequences to comparisons, let's contrast concubinage with prostitution. Prostitution was primarily a commercial transaction, devoid of emotional attachment or long-term commitment. Concubinage, on the other hand, often involved a degree of affection, mutual dependence, and a sustained relationship. But medieval people, well, they understood the spectrum of human connection. The difference was, concubinage offered a semblance of stability and social acceptance that prostitution lacked. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but the potential for companionship and security made it a different world. One might say that prostitution was more of a business transaction, while concubinage was more of a relationship, with a few strings attached, of course. Now that we've covered prostitution, let's talk about other forms of sexual relationships. Think of apprenticeships, servitude, or even forced relationships during wartime. These situations lacked the consent and agency that, in theory, defined concubinage. But medieval people, well, they lived in a world of power imbalances. The difference was vulnerability often left individuals with few choices. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but the stark realities of medieval life often forced people into impossible situations. It's like comparing a chess match to a game of forced checkers. One requires strategy, the other simply survival. From difficult realities to nuanced perspectives, let's delve into the social and political context. The prevalence of concubinage reflected the patriarchal power structures of medieval society. Men, particularly those in positions of authority, often enjoyed greater sexual freedom than women. But medieval people, well, they weren't monolithic. The difference was, some voices did challenge these inequalities, advocating for greater female autonomy and condemning the exploitation of women. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but even in the darkest of times, glimmers of progress emerged. Imagine trying to explain modern feminism to someone in the Middle Ages. Their head would probably explode. Now that we've examined power dynamics, let's focus on the blurry boundaries once more. The lack of clear definitions and consistent enforcement made concubinage a fluid and adaptable practice. It existed in the shadows, whispered about in hushed tones, both tolerated and condemned, depending on the circumstances. But medieval people, well, they were masters of ambiguity. The difference was the absence of rigid rules allowed for individual negotiations and customized arrangements. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but this flexibility could also be a source of empowerment, particularly for women who skillfully navigated the system. Picture this: the crackle of a hearth fire, casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls. You're restless, thoughts swirling like the smoke rising from the embers. Tonight, we delve into a hidden corner of medieval life, a place where women found themselves through vastly different paths, the world of the concubine. What would you do if your village was raided, your home, once a sanctuary, now a smoldering ruin? The reality for many medieval women was brutal. Warfare wasn't just a clash of armies. It was often a descent into chaos, with civilians bearing the brunt of the violence. Women were frequently taken as spoils of war, forced into servitude, and often into concubinage. Imagine the terror, the loss, the complete lack of control. We complain about slow internet speeds. These women faced unimaginable horrors. The concept of consent, as we understand it today, barely existed. These women were commodities, their bodies and their labor at the disposal of the victor. Their fate was sealed not by choice, but by the cruel lottery of war. The life of a modern influencer might seem chaotic, but at least they have agency over their content. These women had none. Now that we've covered the forced entry of women into concubinage, let's talk about another, perhaps equally bleak path: economic necessity. If you've ever struggled to make ends meet, imagine the desperation of a medieval family facing starvation. Sometimes the only way to survive was to offer a daughter into service, often as a concubine. This wasn't seen as a moral failing, but as a pragmatic decision, a terrible choice made to save the rest of the family. The difference, of course, is stark. We might take on a second job to pay the bills. They were essentially selling their daughters into sexual slavery. The weight of that decision, the knowledge of what awaited their child, it's almost unbearable to contemplate. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was slow starvation for everyone, selling your child suddenly looked like a mercy. But what good is a daughter to a family if she herself is starving? The medieval world was a harsh place, and survival often came at a terrible price. These weren't always cold, calculating decisions. Sometimes they were acts of desperate love, twisted and distorted by the relentless pressure of poverty. We complain about rising grocery prices. These families faced literal life or death. Key takeaway: war and poverty forced countless women into concubinage, stripping them of agency and dignity. Speaking of desperate measures, this brings us to the occasional, seemingly voluntary entry into concubinage. Voluntary is a loaded word here, of course. Let's be clear. In a society with limited options for women, the idea of true freedom is questionable. But some women, faced with limited prospects, might have seen concubinage as a path to social or economic advancement. If you've ever considered a career change for better pay or status, you might understand the logic, if not the specific circumstances. A woman with no dowry, no family connections, and limited skills might see becoming a concubine as a step up from poverty or drudgery. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of marrying rich, with a lot more strings attached and considerably fewer rights. The difference was, well, everything. We might swipe right, hoping for a better partner. They were entering a world of power imbalances and precarious positions. Now that we live in an age of dating apps, such trade-offs seems hard to fathom. But the lack of freedom makes such a life choice seem all the more attractive. The problem, of course, is that these women were entering a world of immense power imbalances. They were dependent on the whims of their master, their status always precarious. A new favorite could easily displace them, leaving them with nothing. It was a gamble, a high-stakes game with devastating consequences for those who lost. We might worry about being ghosted. They worried about being discarded and left destitute. From survival to ambition, medieval life required a complex calculation of risks and rewards. Concubinage, for some, was a calculated risk, a desperate attempt to improve their lot in life. But even in these voluntary arrangements, the shadow of societal constraints loomed large. The only real winner was most likely the male in power. Key takeaway: even voluntary concubinage was often a product of limited choices and societal pressures, a desperate gamble for survival or advancement. Hey, let's consider the agency these women possessed, or more accurately, the lack thereof. You know how we talk about empowerment these days, how we encourage women to take control of their lives. That concept was largely foreign to medieval women, especially those in positions of servitude. Their lives were often dictated by the men who controlled them, fathers, husbands, or masters. In the context of concubinage, agency was a rare and precious commodity. Some women might have been able to exert influence within the household, gaining a degree of power through their relationship with their master. They might have secured better treatment for themselves or their children, or even influenced political decisions. Imagine trying to negotiate a raise with your boss while simultaneously navigating a minefield of social and sexual expectations. That was their daily reality. But let's not romanticize things. The vast majority of concubines had little to no agency. They were subject to the whims and desires of their master, their bodies and their lives at his disposal. Their stories are often lost to history, their voices silenced by the powerful men who controlled them. We might complain about microaggressions at work. They faced systemic oppression and exploitation. Here's the thing. History tends to focus on the powerful, the wealthy, the ones who left written records. But the stories of ordinary women, the concubines, the servants, the peasants, are often buried beneath layers of privilege and patriarchy. It's our responsibility to try to unearth those stories, to give voice to the voiceless, and to acknowledge the suffering and resilience of these women. The alternative is letting history be written by men alone. But what good is knowing the stories of those who have never been properly documented? If you've ever felt invisible, imagine the feeling of being erased from history altogether. That was the fate of so many medieval concubines. Their lives were deemed unimportant, their experiences unworthy of recording. To understand them, we must sift through the fragments of evidence that remain: legal documents, court records, personal letters, and the occasional glimpse into their lives through the eyes of male chroniclers. It's like trying to piece together a mosaic with half the tiles missing. Now that we have come to the end, let us not forget the many women who lost their lives and livelihoods for an existence that was not their own free will. Key takeaway: the agency of medieval concubines was severely limited, their stories often erased from history, requiring us to actively seek out and amplify their voices.
The fire's embers glow, painting shadows on the walls. As sleep eludes, let's consider lives lived long ago. Lives often shrouded in silk in romanticism, but far more complex than the tales spun by troubadours. Tonight, we delve beyond the facade, into the world of medieval concubines. What would you do if your worth was measured in progeny and fleeting moments of favor? The image of a concubine often conjures visions of lavish garments, exotic perfumes, and stolen kisses in moonlit gardens. But reality, as it often does, held a harsher truth. These women, though sometimes enjoying periods of comfort and influence, lived a life of precarious servitude. Their days were filled not only with the expected intimacies, but also with the mundane, often back-breaking labor of running a household. Now that we've conjured the silk and perfume image, let's tear it apart and get to the truth, the daily grind. Think of it as being a live-in assistant, but with a very specific job description. The constant threat of displacement hung heavy in the air. A new favorite, a perceived slight, or even simply the master's shifting moods could mean a swift descent into obscurity. If you've ever felt insecure about your job security, imagine having absolutely no job security, plus the distinct possibility of being replaced by someone younger and prettier. Beyond the romanticized image of languid hours spent in silken robes, the daily existence of a medieval concubine was often one of relentless servitude. Imagine a modern-day housekeeper, but without the hourly rate and with the added responsibility of, shall we say, personal services. Their duties extended far beyond the bedroom, encompassing a wide range of domestic tasks. From supervising the kitchen staff and managing household finances, to tending to the master's wardrobe and caring for his children, their responsibilities were varied and demanding. Specific tasks might include overseeing the preparation of meals, ensuring the cleanliness of the household, mending clothes, and even assisting in the care of the sick. They were expected to be skilled in needlework, embroidery, and other domestic arts. Think of Martha Stewart, but with significantly fewer career options. It wasn't all lounging around with a fan made of peacock feathers, though I'm sure some aspired to that. Speaking of children, this brings us to one of the most significant aspects of a concubine's role: producing heirs. A male child could elevate her status, securing her position within the household and providing her with a degree of protection. However, failure to produce an heir, or even simply bearing daughters, could render her vulnerable and expendable. The pressure to conceive was immense, and the methods employed to achieve this goal could be both crude and desperate. One imagines there were a lot of medieval wives' tales about fertility, involving questionable herbs and even more questionable rituals. But what good is security without movement? Restrictions placed on their movement and interaction further compounded their isolation. Unlike a wife who enjoyed a degree of social standing and freedom, a concubine was often confined to the household, her interactions limited to other members of the household staff and occasional visits from the master. She was essentially a gilded cage, her freedom curtailed by her dependent status. Now, it's easy to romanticize freedom. Let's compare it to modern limitations for context. Today, we might complain about being stuck at home during a pandemic, or restricted by social media algorithms, But medieval people, their lives were the algorithm. The difference was they didn't have a choice. Sure, it wasn't perfect. Netflix binges weren't really a thing, and takeout was a very different affair. But when your alternative was social isolation with constant servitude, a limited but relatively stable existence suddenly looked brilliant. From childcare to social isolation, life required both survival skills and strategic manipulation. The emotional toll of being in such a precarious social position cannot be overstated. They lived in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing when their fortunes might change. The fear of being replaced, the humiliation of being treated as a mere object of pleasure, and the longing for a life of dignity and respect must have weighed heavily on their hearts. Imagine being perpetually on audition, knowing that your every move was being scrutinized. Talk about performance anxiety. Consider this. Modern reality TV contestants think they have it rough? They have contracts, lawyers, and, at least theoretically, the option to quit. A medieval concubine? Not so much. There were few avenues for escape, and the consequences of defiance could be dire. Furthermore, the power dynamics within the household were often complex and fraught with tension. Wives naturally resented the presence of concubines, viewing them as a threat to their marital status and their children's inheritance. Servants, too, might harbor resentment, seeing the concubine as an interloper who enjoyed privileges they could only dream of. And I'm sure there was some good old-fashioned gossiping, the water cooler of the medieval era, if you will. The need to navigate these treacherous social currents required a keen understanding of human nature and a talent for manipulation. Key takeaway: the lives of medieval concubines were a constant negotiation between fleeting power and pervasive powerlessness. Now that we've discussed the isolation and labor, let's shift our focus onto the ways in which concubines sought to exert influence and control within their limited sphere. Despite their subordinate status, some women managed to wield considerable power, leveraging their relationships with their masters to achieve personal and political goals. Think of it as medieval office politics, but with higher stakes and far fewer HR regulations. One common strategy was to cultivate alliances with other members of the household, particularly those in positions of power. By friending the master's advisors, secretaries, or even his personal physician, a concubine could gain access to valuable information and exert subtle influence over his decisions. Imagine planting a suggestion in the king's ear, disguised as a casual observation. Another tactic was to use their influence over the master to advance the interests of their own families. They might petition him to grant favors to their relatives, secure positions for their brothers, or even arrange advantageous marriages for their sisters. This was particularly important for women from less privileged backgrounds, who saw their position as an opportunity to improve the lives of their loved ones. But what good is influence without solid connections? If we were to make a modern comparison, think of a social media influencer who uses their platform to promote products or causes they believe in. But medieval people, their platform was literally the king's ear. The difference was access. Sure, modern influencers reach millions, but in the medieval era, reaching one powerful person could change everything. When your alternative was social obscurity, any level of influence suddenly looked brilliant. From familial favors to political maneuvering, life required both charm and cunning. Of course, wielding influence carried its own risks. A concubine who became too ambitious or too assertive could easily arouse suspicion and incur the wrath of the master or his legitimate wife. The line between influence and overreach was often blurred, and the consequences of crossing it could be severe. Think of it as walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. One wrong step could be fatal. The stories of successful concubines who managed to navigate these treacherous waters are often romanticized, but they offer a glimpse into the agency and resilience of these women. They demonstrate that even within the confines of a patriarchal society, women could find ways to exert influence and shape their own destinies. Of course, for every success story, there were countless others who were less fortunate, whose lives were marked by exploitation and despair. And what of the emotional landscape of these women? Imagine being constantly on display, judged for your beauty, your wit, and your ability to please. The emotional toll of being a concubine must have been immense.
The price of privilege, love, loyalty, and the legitimate wife. Ever wonder what it was like to be married in the Middle Ages, only to discover your husband also kept a concubine? It wasn't exactly a Hallmark movie. This chapter delves into the messy, often brutal realities of marriage and concubinage, exploring the power dynamics, legal loopholes, and societal pressures that shaped the lives of medieval women. So, let's talk about the legitimate wife. She was the queen of her husband's castle, a symbol of his status, and the bearer of his legitimate heirs. Think of her as the CEO of the household, managing the staff, the finances, and generally keeping the family afloat. But what happened when the CEO discovered her husband had a special projects manager in the form of a concubine? The legal rights of a wife in the Middle Ages varied wildly depending on the region, social class, and the whims of her husband. Generally speaking, noble women had more legal protections than peasant women. But even for the elite, these rights were often more theoretical than practical. A wife might have the right to inherit property, for example, but good luck wresting control of it from her husband or his family. It was less "Yas Queen" and more "Please, sir, may I have some more?" And what happened if a husband decided he wanted to divorce his wife? Well, that depended. In the early Middle Ages, divorce was somewhat more common, particularly in Germanic societies. But as the influence of the Church grew, divorce became increasingly difficult, especially for women. Annulments were possible, but they usually required proving that the marriage was invalid from the start, perhaps due to consanguinity, impotence, or some other impediment. Imagine trying to convince the local bishop that your husband's lack of enthusiasm was grounds for an annulment. Good luck with that. But what about the children? Ah, the children. The legitimate wife's primary duty was to produce legitimate heirs, preferably male ones. These children had clear rights of inheritance and social status. But what about the children born to the concubine? Well, that's where things get complicated. In many cases, these children were considered illegitimate and had no legal claim to their father's title or property. However, some rulers did legitimize their illegitimate children, often for political reasons. It was like a medieval version of retroactive adoption, only with potentially disastrous consequences for the legitimate heirs. Now that we've established the wife's precarious legal position, let's delve into the simmering cauldron of emotions within the household. Imagine the scene: the legitimate wife meticulously managing the estate, only to catch a glimpse of her husband strolling through the gardens with his concubine, perhaps sharing a stolen kiss or a private joke. Jealousy? Resentment? A desire to poison the well? The relationship between the wife and the concubine was rarely friendly. Competition for the husband's attention, affection, and resources was inevitable. The wife, despite her higher social standing, might feel threatened by the concubine, particularly if the concubine was younger, more beautiful, or, perhaps most importantly, capable of producing a male heir when the wife could not. It was like a corporate rivalry, only with way more petticoats and potential for bloodshed. However, sometimes alliances could form between the wife and the concubine. This might happen if both women shared a common enemy, such as a tyrannical husband or an overbearing mother-in-law. Or perhaps they simply realized that cooperation was a more effective strategy than constant infighting. Think of it as a medieval version of Thelma and Louise, only instead of driving off a cliff, they're plotting to subtly influence their husband's decisions. Speaking of societal pressures, both the wife and the concubine faced intense scrutiny from their communities. The wife was expected to be virtuous, obedient, and fertile. Failure to meet these expectations could result in social ostracism or even accusations of witchcraft. The concubine, on the other hand, was often stigmatized as a fallen woman, even if she had no choice in her situation. She was a walking, talking scandal, a constant reminder of the husband's infidelity. You might call it a lose-lose situation for both parties. But what good is all this drama without a bit of juicy historical anecdote? Consider the story of Agnes of Poitiers, the wife of Holy Roman Emperor Henry III in the 11th century. Henry was known for his piety and his, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly celibate. Agnes, despite her own religious devotion, reportedly tolerated her husband's infidelities, even going so far as to raise his illegitimate children alongside her own. Was this a testament to her saintly nature, or a pragmatic acceptance of the realities of medieval court life? You be the judge. From societal pressure to childbirth, medieval life required a stiff upper lip and a strong tolerance for awkward family dinners. Now that we've explored the complex dynamics between the wife and the concubine, let's turn our attention to the children born of these unions. As we mentioned earlier, the status of these children varied wildly. Legitimate children were heirs to their father's titles and property, while illegitimate children often faced a life of social marginalization. However, there were exceptions. Some rulers recognized their illegitimate children, granting them titles, lands, and even arranged advantageous marriages. It was like a medieval version of Game of Thrones, only with the rules were constantly shifting and the stakes were incredibly high. Here's the thing. The Church, despite its disapproval of concubinage, sometimes played a role in legitimizing illegitimate children. This was particularly true in cases where the ruler needed a capable successor and the legitimate line was weak. The Church might grant a dispensation, essentially retroactively blessing the child's birth and allowing him or her to inherit. It was a convenient loophole, allowing rulers to circumvent the rules of succession without completely defying the Church's authority. Talk about having your cake and eating it too. Ever wonder how these children felt about their ambiguous status? Imagine being raised in the shadow of your legitimate half-siblings, knowing that you would never fully belong. Or conversely, imagine being a legitimate heir, constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering if your father might suddenly decide to legitimize your illegitimate sibling and usurp your inheritance. It was a recipe for sibling rivalry on a truly epic scale. But what about the concubine herself? What was her life like after she had given birth to her lover's child? In some cases, she might be elevated to a position of influence within the household, becoming a trusted advisor to the ruler. She might even be granted her own lands and resources. However, in other cases, she might be cast aside, left to fend for herself and her child. It all depended on the whims of the ruler and the political climate of the time. A royal pregnancy could be the best. The flickering candlelight dances on the page, much like the hopes of a medieval concubine clinging to the possibility of a brighter future for her child. If you've ever felt the weight of uncertainty about your children's well-being, you can perhaps glimpse the anxieties that haunted these women. For them, the stakes were impossibly high. The question looms, what future awaited the children born outside the secret bonds of marriage? These children, often referred to as illegitimate, occupied a precarious space in medieval society. Their legal status was at best ambiguous, a hazy landscape of inconsistent laws and capricious interpretations. They weren't quite invisible, but their existence was often acknowledged with a whisper, a sideways glance, a silent judgment. It's like being perpetually stuck in the friend zone, but with potentially devastating consequences. Think about modern birth certificates and the rights and protections they afford. But medieval people, well, let's just say their record-keeping wasn't exactly up to par. The difference was that a piece of parchment could mean the difference between a life of relative security and one of abject poverty. Sure, it wasn't perfect, this haphazard system of recognition. But when your alternative was being completely erased from the social fabric, a little recognition went a long way. The Church, which held immense sway over such matters, often took a lenient stance, sometimes. The mood of the local bishop, apparently, was a key factor. Key takeaway: Illegitimacy in the Middle Ages meant navigating a legal and social minefield. Now that we've covered the murky legal status, let's talk about the children themselves. These were, after all, real people, with real hopes and dreams. They were not simply legal footnotes. Imagine being born into a world where your very existence is questioned, where the whispers follow you like shadows. The sheer psychological toll must have been immense. They faced limitations on inheritance, restrictions on holding certain offices, and social stigma that could haunt them for life. Their chances of marrying well were often diminished, their career prospects curtailed. Think of it like trying to run a marathon with your shoelaces tied together. Possible, perhaps, but undeniably harder. If you've ever felt excluded from a group, you can only imagine the profound sense of otherness these children experienced. Society had a way of reminding them, subtly or not so subtly, that they were different. "Oh, you're his son. How interesting," said with a raised eyebrow. Speaking of inheritance, this brings us to the heart of the matter, the battle for legitimacy and the scramble for a piece of the pie. Because everyone loves a good inheritance squabble, even back then. The laws governing inheritance varied widely from region to region, but one thing remained constant. Children born within marriage were almost always given priority. The problem was almost always left a crack in the door, a sliver of hope for children of concubines. Some fathers, moved by affection or perhaps a sense of guilt, might attempt to provide for their natural children, as they were sometimes euphemistically called. This could take the form of granting them land, bestowing titles, or even arranging advantageous marriages. But here's the thing. Such provisions were rarely straightforward. They could be challenged by legitimate heirs, contested in court, or simply revoked on a whim. It was a constant game of legal chess, with the children of concubines often starting several moves behind. The whole system was about as fair as a jousting match where one knight is riding a donkey. Key takeaway: inheritance was a battlefield where the children of concubines fought for recognition and a share of their father's legacy. But what good is legal maneuvering without the love and protection of a mother? The role of the concubine in securing her child's future was often crucial. Deprived of the legal rights afforded to wives, they had to rely on their wits, their charm, and their unwavering devotion. Long before helicopter parenting was a thing, medieval concubines were fiercely advocating for their children. Many concubines wielded considerable influence over their partners, using their position to advocate for their children's welfare. They might lobby for land grants, secure advantageous apprenticeships, or even subtly manipulate court politics to favor their offspring. Their love was a shield, their cunning a weapon. They navigated the treacherous currents of courtly life, always with their children's best interests at heart. They were the original mama bears, except instead of threatening emails to the school board, they were whispering strategic advice into the ear of a king. However, this was not always a story of triumphant mothers single-handedly securing their children's futures. Many faced insurmountable obstacles, hostile family members, vindictive rivals, or simply the cold indifference of a patriarchal society. It was tough enough being a woman in the Middle Ages without the added stigma of being a concubine and mother of a bastard. It's like trying to climb a greased pole in a hurricane. Key takeaway: the love and determination of concubines were often the only weapons their children had in their fight for survival and a better future. From love to war, let's not forget that sometimes these battles for inheritance could turn violent. Rivalries between legitimate and illegitimate children could escalate into open conflict, tearing families apart and destabilizing kingdoms. If you've ever watched a particularly dramatic episode of Succession, you have some idea of the kind of familial chaos that could ensue. Except instead of corporate boardrooms, the battles were fought with swords and siege engines. The stakes were incredibly high: control of land, titles, and ultimately power. The children of concubines, often fueled by a sense of injustice and a desire for recognition, might resort to drastic measures to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Imagine the family holiday dinners. Pass the gravy and maybe a dagger. Sometimes they succeeded, carving out their own destinies through sheer force of will. More often, however, they met with tragedy, their ambitions thwarted by the entrenched power of the established order. Such rebellions were almost always swiftly and brutally suppressed. Medieval society had little tolerance for challenges to the established order, and those who dared to defy it often paid the ultimate price. It was a high-risk, high-reward gamble, and the odds were rarely in their favor. Key takeaway: inheritance was a battlefield where the children of concubines fought for recognition and a share of their father's legacy. But what good is legal maneuvering without the love and protection of a mother? The role of the concubine in securing her child's future was often crucial. Deprived of the legal rights afforded to wives, they had to rely on their wits, their charm, and their unwavering devotion. Long before Forgotten Echoes. Finding the concubines in the historical record. Have you ever tried to assemble a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and those you do have are faded and chewed by time? That's essentially what it's like to try and reconstruct the lives of medieval concubines. The challenge isn't simply that they were overlooked, though, let's be honest, being a concubine wasn't exactly a fast track to historical immortality. It's that their stories are deliberately obscured, buried beneath layers of societal disapproval, legal ambiguity, and the simple fact that history, for a long time, was written by and for the powerful. Imagine if Twitter were only written by kings. You'd miss a lot of the juicy details. So how do we even begin to find these forgotten women? We become historical detectives, piecing together fragments from the available sources, understanding that the silence surrounding them speaks volumes in itself. Think of it this way. Legal documents might mention provisions for certain women and their children, conveniently skipping the relationship status. Chronicles detail the births of illegitimate heirs, often glossing over the mother. Literature, while sometimes offering glimpses of concubines as characters, frequently paints them in highly stylized, moralizing ways. And art? Well, finding a portrait titled Gertrude, the king's favorite concubine, is about as likely as finding a unicorn grazing in your backyard. But there is the occasional legal record that goes into unexpected detail, and a few paintings give a glint of truth. They have to be uncovered, though. Let's start with the legal documents. These official records, often dry and tedious, can inadvertently illuminate the lives of concubines. We're not necessarily looking for explicit mentions of concubine. That would be far too easy. Instead, we look for phrases like natural children, maintenance for a certain woman, or gifts bestowed upon a female companion. These are the breadcrumbs that lead us to the unacknowledged women in powerful men's lives. The legal framework rarely criminalized concubinage outright, often occupying a strange gray area. It was tolerated, even common, especially among the clergy. It's like that one weird uncle everyone pretends isn't even related, technically part of the family, but never invited to Thanksgiving. Imagine a modern-day prenup, but instead of protecting assets, it vaguely protects reputations. Medieval legal documents concerning concubines often served a similar purpose, acknowledging the relationship and providing for the woman and her children without officially legitimizing them. These documents show that concubines had some, albeit limited, legal standing. They could, in certain circumstances, own property, receive gifts, and even inherit from their partner. Key takeaway: legal documents, while discreet, offer vital clues about the practical arrangements and occasional protections afforded to concubines. Speaking of discretion, let's turn to the Chronicles. These historical accounts, penned by monks, court scribes, and other chroniclers, are often our primary source of information about medieval events and figures. However, when it comes to concubines, these chronicles tend to be selective. Chroniclers were typically employed by the elite, and their writing reflected the biases and interests of their patrons. Mentioning a king's mistress might be acceptable, even unavoidable, if it led to political intrigue or a succession crisis. But detailing the everyday lives of concubines, their hopes, fears, and experiences, that was rarely deemed worthy of recording. It was like reality TV, but the producers only filmed the dinner parties and conveniently forgot about the dramatic bathroom fights. The way concubines were portrayed in chronicles also depended heavily on the chronicler's own moral and religious views. Some might condemn the practice outright, portraying concubines as scheming seductresses who threatened the moral fabric of society. Others might offer a more sympathetic, or at least neutral account, acknowledging the practical realities of concubinage in a world where marriage was often a political or economic arrangement. Now that we've discussed the official records, let's look at the creative arts. Medieval literature and art offer another window into the lives of concubines, albeit a highly filtered and often idealized one. In literature, concubines might appear as characters in romances, poems, and moral tales. Sometimes they are portrayed as objects of desire, temptresses who lead men astray. Other times they are depicted as victims, forced into their position by circumstances beyond their control. If they were alive today, they might have very dramatic reality shows. Art, too, offers glimpses of concubines, though these are often more subtle and symbolic. A painting might depict a nobleman with a mysterious woman who is not his wife, subtly hinting at an extramarital relationship. Sculptures and tapestries might feature scenes of courtly love, where the lines between legitimate and illegitimate relationships are blurred. The question then becomes, what about actual depictions, portraits? The answer is more complicated. Finding a portrait specifically identified as a concubine is rare. But consider portraits of noble women. Could some of these women have been concubines, elevated to positions of influence? It's possible, even likely, that some of the women we see in these portraits were in fact concubines who managed to navigate the treacherous waters of courtly life. Key takeaway: literature and art provide glimpses of the lives of concubines, but these depictions are often shaped by societal biases and artistic conventions. What about archaeological records? This may seem like a long shot. After all, how would an archaeological dig reveal the presence of a concubine? But consider this. Archaeological sites associated with medieval castles, palaces, and monasteries often contain evidence of domestic life. Excavations might uncover items of jewelry, clothing, or personal adornment that could have belonged to concubines. The location of these finds within the site could also be revealing. Were they found in the main living quarters or in a more secluded area? Of course, interpreting these finds is not always straightforward. It's difficult to say with certainty that a particular item belonged to a concubine rather than a wife, daughter, or other female resident of the site. So what can the lives of concubines tell us about women in medieval society? It's a complex question with no easy answers. On one hand, the existence of concubinage highlights the limited options available to women in medieval society. Marriage was often an economic or political arrangement, and many women had little say in who they married. For some women, becoming a concubine might have offered a degree of financial security and social status that they would not otherwise have had. Sure, it wasn't ideal, but it was better than starving in a ditch. On the other hand, the position of concubine was inherently precarious and disempowering. Concubines lacked the legal rights and social recognition of wives. Their status depended entirely on the favor of their partner, and they could be easily discarded if he found someone else. Imagine working a job where you could be fired at any moment, for any reason, with no recourse. This brings us to power dynamics.